Controlling the d5 square immediately opens up strategic possibilities and fights for central influence. Developing the knight so early keeps options open while challenging white's central aspirations. Developing another piece, nc3 immediately contests central squares and prepares for d4, aiming for a harmonious pawn structure. Embracing the king's Indian setup, g6 prepares for bg7, aiming to control the long diagonal and build a resilient pawn chain. Seizing the center boldly, white aggressively challenges black's fianchetto setup. Gaining diagonal dominion, the bishop now eyes the center and prepares for queenside expansion. Establishing central control and preparing for kingside castling, this pawn push solidifies white's space advantage. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this pawn advance opens up the dark-squared bishop's diagonal. Securing the center's integrity, the knight ventures forth, preparing for queenside castling and a robust pawn structure. Anchoring the king's safety with a swift castle demonstrates a prudent prioritization of defensive infrastructure before engaging in any central skirmishes. Building a solid pawn center, white prepares to support the d4 pawn and potentially expand on the kingside. Developing the knight to its most natural outpost solidifies black's central grip and prepares for future queenside expansion. Securing the knight on d2 prepares a knight transfer to f3, bolstering the kingside and eyeing potential breaks with e5 or c5. Challenging the center's pawn structure immediately, aiming for an active, potentially complex pawn skirmish. White solidifies the center, claiming crucial space and preparing for a potential kingside attack. Unlocking the light-squared diagonal for the bishop, this pawn thrust initiates a sharp central confrontation, aiming to disrupt white's spatial advantage. Solidifying the pawn chain's backbone, this bishop repositions to support the central structure and prepare for potential pawn advances. Rerouting the knight to the queenside opens up the e-file and prepares to contest the center. Solidifying the center, white readies for a potential pawn push, aiming to restrict black's knight. Solidifying the center with this pawn thrust immediately creates a locked pawn structure, forcing a positional battle for control of the d5 square. Positioning the queen here supports a potential kingside attack and eyes the weak f7 square. This aggressive pawn thrust cracks open the center, demanding immediate attention and potentially creating dynamic imbalances. Releasing central tension opens a dynamic battleground, forcing black to confront white's initiative head-on across the newly liberated diagonals. Opening that kingside rook file unleashes tremendous counterplay. Unleashing the f-pawn injects immediate tension, potentially cracking open the kingside for an assault. Pushing the pawn opens lines, but potentially weakens the kingside's pawn structure. Shifting the king to a safer square, away from the central pawn chain's potential collapse. Sacrificing material to shatter the opponent's pawn structure around the king is a bold gambit. Establishing a dynamic knight outpost on d1 clears the way for future piece development and prepares a potential kingside assault. F6 reinforces the e4 pawn's advanced position and prepares to challenge white's central control. Rerouting the knight to a more active square, aiming to exploit the open diagonals and potentially target weaknesses around black's king. Eliminating the strong white bishop opens crucial lines, creating dynamic imbalances as black seeks counterplay. Recapturing on e3 solidifies the central pawn structure and prepares to challenge black's active knight, aiming for a more controlled game. Repositioning the rook to f7 aims to bolster the kingside and potentially open the f-file for future action. Reclaiming central space and preparing to support the d-pawn advance. Unleashing a queenside pawn storm attempts to generate counterplay against white's solid structure. Shaping a new defensive barrier, this maneuver seeks to solidify the kingside and restrict black's imposing bishop. Unleashing a knight toward the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's defensive setup and exploit the weakened g-file. Consolidating the knight to a more robust central post sets the stage for improved pawn structure control. The rook bravely ventures, eyeing open lines and daring a confrontation on the g-file, potentially destabilizing white's king. Shifting the queen to c3 prepares to eye the kingside and support a potential g4 pawn push, aiming to dismantle black's defensive structure. Activating the queen to pressure white's d5 pawn and challenge the central space white has aggressively claimed. Clearing the queen from the center opens up attacking chances on the kingside by activating the rooks. Unlocking the knight's central influence, this exchange clarifies the pawn structure and prepares for a dynamic middle game. Solidifying the c-file opens lines for a potential queenside expansion. Finally, black develops the bishop, aiming to activate the queenside and potentially challenge the open c-file for a more balanced middle game. The rook now prepares to support the pawn push, aiming to seize more central space. Relocating the king to the 7th rank solidifies its safety while preparing for potential central pawn advances. Shifting the rook to the kingside aims to join the assault on black's weakened structure. Reactivating the g-file opens communication lines for the rooks, aiming to challenge white's queenside initiative. Consolidating the king's safety now, a wise precaution given the open files and black's piece activity. Anchoring the rook on the b-file aims to disrupt white's queenside control and potentially open new avenues. Preparing to advance the kingside pawn chain, aiming to dislodge black's rook from the strategic g-file and expand white's space. Opening a diagonal for the bishop, while offering a dynamic outpost for the knight on f6. Liberating the knight to a more active square, potentially eyeing central squares and forcing black to reevaluate piece placement. This pawn move anchors the kingside and prepares to develop the queenside initiative, potentially opening the queenside for the rook. This maneuver seeks to unblock the kingside pawns and initiate counterplay along the central files. Opening the queenside flank with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's control and create counterplay on the vast open spaces. Confronting the rook on the queenside, white initiates an aggressive queenside push, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and seize open lines. Anchoring the monarch to the center provides a vital defensive hub amidst the queenside pawn storm. Doubling rooks along the c-file now directly pressures black's entire queenside structure. Rerouting the knight offers fresh attacking possibilities, seeking to exploit weaknesses on the kingside. Opening the c-file promises active play and pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. Opening the queenside files grants significant counterplay and challenges white's central pawn structure. Liberating the rook opens a vital diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's island of pawns. The rook's repositioning on the open file immediately intensifies pressure on white's queenside. This pawn push aims to solidify the queenside and potentially liberate the rook on a8 for activity. Repositioning the knight to a less active square signals a potential kingside regrouping, aiming to redeploy forces for future play. Repositioning the knight to b1 offers flexibility, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square. Reactivating the knight to a more central outpost will help challenge white's queenside space. Re-establishing knight centralization, this piece aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially attack squares like d5. Shifting the rook to the open file prepares to contest control of that crucial pathway across the board. Activating the kingside flank pawn creates a new attacking avenue, potentially unbalancing the queenside pawn structure and opening lines for the king. The knight retreats, preserving its piece while preparing for a potential future defense on the kingside. Unlocking the queenside, this pawn thrust seeks to dismantle black's defenses by creating passed pawns and exploiting potential weaknesses. Reuniting the knights to a more active square offers counterplay against white's queenside expansion. Preparing to contest the file and exploit the pawn structure's rigidity. Challenging the pawn chain to open lines is a bold attempt to disrupt white's queenside advantage. Activating the bishop here finally opens lines for your pieces and prepares for central pawn advances. Repositioning the knight to f7 opens a path for the other knight to infiltrate on the king side, creating dangerous attacking potential. Clearing the bishop's path facilitates its redeployment to a more active diagonal. The knight's maneuver to a8 allows for a potential kingside pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's defensive setup. Asserting the open file, this allows pressure on black's weak pawn structure. Initiating a rook maneuver to exploit the queenside space and potentially create dynamic play on that flank. Recentralizing the knight aims to bolster the kingside pawn structure and prepare for a potential pawn advance. Shifting the rook to the center opens lines for potential pawn breakthroughs or pressure on white's queenside. Activating the knight to the central outpost disrupts black's pawn structure and eyes weaknesses. Unleashing a knight fork creates a dynamic tactical opportunity, disrupting white's coordinated pieces and forcing an immediate defensive reaction. Exchanging bishops clears the way for a pawn break, aiming to activate the knight. The king's exposed position now invites a swift mating attack. Trading off this knight decisively opens the g-file for the rook and simplifies the position for white. Opening the h-file creates immediate attacking chances against the exposed white king. Centering the king offers central support, preparing for a more active role in the approaching endgame complexities. Stepping the king into the center initiates endgame activity, aiming to exploit open lines. Securing the rook on the queenside flank while preparing to contest the open, a file. The rook repositions, preparing to contest the crucial open c-file and support its advanced kingside pawn. Seeking central control, this knight repositions to support the pawn structure and prepare for potential future advances. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank aims to create a persistent nuisance on that open file, potentially harassing the white king or supporting pawn advances. Repositioning the knight to c3 aims to improve its influence on the queenside pawns and potentially support an eventual pawn push. Repositioning the king prepares for potential pawn advances and consolidates the defensive structure on the queenside. Centralizing the monarch now offers superior activity and control over key squares. Relocating the king aims to contest central control and prepare for potential pawn advances. Repositioning the rook to the file seeks to activate it for potential counterplay against black's queenside pawns. Relocating the king offers a more active role in the developing endgame, seeking to support the knight and pawn majority. Recentralizing the king offers greater flexibility for maneuvering the remaining pieces. Shifting the king towards the queenside aims to solidify its safety and prepare for a potential rook lift. Kings recentering for defensive support, aiming to solidify structure before black's pieces can penetrate. Relocating the king to the queenside allows for potential piece maneuvering and future pawn advances. Relocating the king to the center prepares for pawn advances and king activity in the simplified position. The king ventures out, seeking active participation in the endgame's dynamic. Positioning the king defensively, preparing for potential exchanges and pawn advances. Relocating the king to the queenside opens up avenues for it to participate in the pawn endgame. Consolidating kingside presence by repositioning the rook opens potential for queenside counterplay. Relocating the king now offers a better chance to contest the central squares and potentially create weaknesses. Asserting control over the b-file is paramount to initiating any serious plan, preparing for future pawn advances or piece activity. Preparing to shift the king to a more active, central position for the endgame battle. Probing the queenside flank with the pawn will test black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for the rook. Shifting the king again mirrors white's repeated king movements, seeking a better square in the static queenside setup. Seizing the passed pawn on the queenside creates a dangerous threat that black must address immediately. Snatching the pawn opens the bishop, aiming to activate it for endgame skirmishes. Controlling the file gives white a crucial advantage in coordinating their remaining pieces for the endgame. Pivoting the king to seek refuge on the queenside provides a crucial escape route from potential checks along the open files. Repositioning the monarch to a safer square avoids any immediate checks and prepares for potential pawn advances. Repositioning the bishop to the queen side to potentially support a pawn push or defend against threats. Consolidating the king towards the center is paramount for activity in this endgame. Preparing to seize the open c-file and activate the remaining rook on the queen side. Activating the king into the center offers new avenues for play and support. Shifting the king inward initiates a crucial pawn-pushing strategy to challenge white's central control. Pivoting the king aggressively toward the queen side opens up possibilities for pawn advances and king activity in the latter stages. Shifting the monarch towards the queen side offers a slight improvement in activity, preparing for potential pawn advances. Repositioning the monarch to a more active square, preparing to support the pawn majority on the queen side. The bishop retreats, seeking refuge on a broad diagonal to potentially influence the queenside pawn storm. Ramping up pressure on the queen side, this rook repositioning eyes the weak b5 pawn. Shifting the rook to the open file now forces white to confront the pawn structure's weaknesses. Rerouting the knight to a more active square prepares potential breakthroughs on the king side. Unlocking the queen side by opening a path for the bishop to infiltrate. This advance looks to finally free the knight, aiming to disrupt the coordinated black pieces. The pawns on the queen side finally engage, initiating a decisive struggle for control of the passed pawn. Sacrificing the knight here opens a critical pathway for the king, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn push and regain initiative. The rook's relocation to c8 aims to defend the critical passed pawn, but it overlooks the immediate threat to white's king. Repositioning the knight to e3 aims to shore up the central pawn structure and prevent further pawn incursions by black. Reactivating the dormant bishop to contest the crucial central squares is a sound idea. Sacrificing pawn advances king out, potentially unlocking endgame opportunities with the monarch as an active piece. Pushing the king towards the queen side prepares to activate the bishop for a decisive pawn push. Pushing this pawn aggressively creates a dangerous passed threat, demanding immediate attention from black. Averting immediate danger, the rook retreats to a safer square, preserving its defensive influence. Activating the rook to defend the king and contest the open file is a sensible step in this tense endgame.